This will be fun.
All right. This should be fun. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to another episode of This Week in Drones, coming to you live every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. And as we're live, send in those comments, your thoughts, type away on those keyboards because we will pull them up on the screen. Depends on how many come in at once, but we're going to try to hash through those as we go through this topic. We are talking about right of way between drones and manned aviation, especially when we're talking low altitude. We're going to see under that 400-foot elevation so much more drone activity, unmanned activity of who knows, all sorts of package delivery and 911, dispatch using drones, just drones flying off the rooftops of law enforcement agencies in major cities. And we're going to start to see more and more drone activity across the skies. And what is that going to mean then for manned aviation, helicopters, Cessnas, other takeoff landing points, or search and rescue helicopters trying to pick people up and they're hovering at 100 feet or whatever the case. You start to see that convergence of those two airspaces, low and high altitude. And so who should have the right of way? Should it be the helicopter pilot? Should it be the drone operator who had the waiver and had the permission to be there? So we're going to dive into that here in a minute with a bunch of experts and different in coming from different perspectives here. A lot of good friends from the pod that I'm sure you all recognize. But I'm going to start really quick with showing a poll that I put up that a lot of you guys responded to, and it's still live actually. If you go out and find it on my LinkedIn, you can put in your answer to this. But here's kind of the breakdown of how many people, what percentage thinks that drones should have the right of way in that low altitude versus manned aviation having the right of way, continuing to have the right of way as they do now. And then a solid 30%, 31% said it depends on the situation. Pretty interesting there. So I think we're split. I guess it's almost 50-50 between sort of drones and depends and then manned aviation, but obviously manned aviation is still in the lead here. So we'll hear different perspectives again from our lovely panelists as we go through this. But I just wanted to highlight this for y'all out there, and this conversation sparked because a couple of folks here, Carter and Brandon, were hashing back and forth on a LinkedIn post recently too, and so we thought it'd be fun to bring it to the live podcast and deep dive it. Before I forget, and we'll dive into the conversation here in a second. Check out the commercial UAV coming up. A handful of us are going to be there. I just wanted to highlight it for folks because it's another great chance to meet in person. It's going to be in Vegas early September. We're going to keep diving into all these topics together face to face, which I think is always really a great time. So with that said, we're going to jump into it, and it looks like there's people already commenting. Richard Reynolds, hey out there. Anyone else? If you want to throw in a comment real quick, if you're out there listening right now and we're live, throw out your comment of, do you think drones should have right of way in the low altitude? Do you think aircraft? Do you think it depends? Give us your quick hot take on it. So with that said, I'm going to pass it around the circle, and I want to hear from each perspective on the panel your sort of just quick, 30-second, 60-second take on this issue. What does it mean? What do you think? Who should have the right of way? And kind of a quick thought on why, and then we'll deep dive it here in a second. So let's start with Matt Sloan.
Yeah. Oh, great. Start with me. Thanks so much. I was waiting to hear all these experts' opinions before I gave mine, but I know I would say I'm in the depends category. I mean, I am a manned aircraft pilot, so my default is always manned gets right away. But I also understand we operate drone first responder programs, and so I am concerned about low altitude aircraft, particularly helicopters. When we're operating off of rooftops and in certain areas where helicopters are flying as well too. So I'm very much in the depends category. I could be swayed either way by the other experts on this panel. So we'll see where the hour takes us.
Awesome. Carter, you want to throw in your hat?
Yeah. Did you want to throw up the ARC recommendation? I think we were going to kind of use that as the spark, because I want to piggyback off what Matt said. The ARC recommendation was drones have right of way for non-transponding aircraft. So if the aircraft has its ADS-B on, then the manned aircraft always has the right of way, right? So it's not just always drones. It's drones have to get out of the way of manned aircraft, unless you have this special case where they're not using ADS-B. And so I'm going to come at this from the angle of I think drones should have the right of way over non-transponding aircraft. And the conversation that Brandon and I got into on LinkedIn was really a special case. A lot of times when people have this conversation, it's general aviation pilots don't want ADS-B. They haven't had it in the past. They're grandfathered in. It's a privacy issue. There's a whole bunch of things that they say. I'm not a general aviation pilot, so I can say all kinds of great things about them. Not having dealt with it myself, I'm sure they're all great, actual reasons. But the use case that Brandon brought up was one that isn't often considered. It's not usually in the argument, and that was about security, military or public safety. I think that'll be a good one to dig into today. So I have lots of thoughts on it, but I'll save those for the debate.
Awesome. Brandon, you want to pull up that arc and make your comments?
Yeah. All right. Hang on. Let me share screen window. So I have two things to show. Okay.
Oops.
You got to pull down your screen sharing.
There you go.
David. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Good. Window. Okay. So in the ARC recommendation that was conducted in 2022, here is recommendation FR22, which is saying if you have ADS-B equipped and you're broadcasting out via the network, then the manned aircraft has right of way over drones as it is today. Now, here's the piece that I threw up on LinkedIn, which kind of went down this rabbit hole, but the ARC recommends that unmanned aircraft operations in non-shielded low altitude areas, I think we're going to avoid the non-shielded discussion for right now, have right of way over crewed aircraft that are not equipped with ADS-B out as specified in 14 CFR 91.225. So 91.225, if you go to the 14 CFR regulations, this is what it is. And there's a specific exemption in provision F, which says ADS-B out must operate this equipment mode at all times unless this right here, which are sensitive government missions. And there's actually a proposed legislation right now to change the definition of what a sensitive government mission is due to the midair out of DCA. But until that happens, aircraft that are conducting missions of these types do not have to broadcast ADS-B out in order to obscure their location and not push that out as publicly available information. So I just did a stop there. So why this is let's say CBP, DEA, or any of these others are along the border, the cartels will track FlightAware and all these other tools to pull down that ADS-B feed to find out where certain law enforcement aircraft may or may not be, to prepare themselves for a door kicker operation or a drug house raid or stuff like that. The other thing from a national security perspective, if the military is flying around with ADS-B, you can track the movement of all of our military aircraft all over the planet. And that's a big problem from obscuring where our military assets are. And obviously we don't want our adversaries to know specifically where those aircraft are. So that's a problem. And so that's why there's this ADS-B off carve out for those types of operations. So now for me personally, I think, I'm a security person. I have been my entire career. Most of my career was in the military. And so I'm very sensitive to these types of operations. And it's one of the first things I think of on any of this stuff. And I have a significant issue with a pilot who is doing a low-level mission supporting ground law enforcement or military or whatever that might be. It's an incredibly dangerous and task saturated situation. And these helicopter pilots that are doing wheels, they don't have the bandwidth to be looking out for small drones that might be media or any of these other flight operations to avoid those small drones. It's incredibly dangerous. The other piece of this that I've always and will have issues with is under no circumstance that I can think of would a non-occupied aircraft, a drone, have to give way, or have the right of way over an aircraft where a human is sitting. And so I just think that's incredibly dangerous and just a fundamental fact about difference between drone operations and human operations is if there's blood involved or not. And that's my perspective.
Excellent. Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that. Ron, you want to give it a stab? And then actually we've got Wes here in the back channel. I'll pull you up here in a minute, Wes, to give your 60-second take on the matter. Then we're going to deep dive a little bit more. But Ron, what do you think? If you want to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear your take on should drones or should manned aircraft have the right of way in that low altitude airspace?
The way the rules are written, least maneuverable aircraft is going to have to give way to the other one, right? Drones are currently at the bottom of the food chain. And I think that, to Brandon's point, that there's a body inside of a manned aircraft versus a drone, which does not have somebody's skin in the game when it comes to flying. I think the drones should always give way. The aircraft, ADSB is not even a requirement unless you're within 30 nautical miles of a major airport anyway. So people can be flying around without ADSB, doing their thing. With the exception of the border areas, I see that as a potential issue. You'd certainly want to mask security and public safety and military operations. But think of the power line patrols that go through neighborhoods with helicopters. That's technically in a shielded area with some of the BV loss work that's coming out, right? Are drones going to occupy that space at the same time? Maybe a realtor's got a job next to a power line and here comes a helicopter chugging through. You're going to see the larger aircraft first versus, maybe at the last minute, a helicopter pilot or crew member may see a drone. I think that, it would, for me, it seems like common sense that a larger aircraft would have the priority over an unmanned aircraft.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot more to it, but what pops in my head is the DCA crash between a helicopter and airliner full of people. It's sort of that common sense in my head that the smaller, more agile, less people on board should get out of the way of the one that's coming in. That's a lot harder to, it's a lot harder to see the helicopter, I think, maybe, but I'm just throwing that out there. Michelle, do you want to throw in your 60-second take? Drones or manned aircraft? Who should have the right of way, or does it depend?
It depends. So,
shucks, I thought you were going to take us home with a.
No, I think it's all the above. Actually, there are logical arguments for both sides, and for it depends. So, I think we would be crazy to continue down a path of thinking about drones and manned aircraft intersecting in a completely unstructured environment where there isn't an intent for that specific airspace to have either or as a primary operation or to be deliberately stood up as mixed environment. And if it is mixed environment, then yeah, we've got to have these conversations. But I think sometimes we get caught, we go down a rabbit hole where we just lump everything together. Public safety, in my opinion, always has priority, period. So if it's a law enforcement or any kind of sensitive operation, so Brandon, I agree that they do have to revisit that definition. But our homeland security, our national defense, our law enforcement, that has to be priority, especially when they're executing a tactical mission. I mean, mic drop there. That does not mean that our commercial aviation system takes a kick in the teeth. And drones are now part of our commercial aviation system. So we've got to figure out where those boundaries are, where it should be mostly drones, 400 feet and below. If we're not going to talk about shielded, I think that's a good move too, because that's kind of pretty clear. But non-shielded, below 400 feet, drone operations, I don't think we should stop there. Let's keep going and talk about the environment that those operations are happening in. And is it feasible to think that there is going to be a mass of drones in a certain area that is very rural versus the low manned flight in that same area? Or are we talking apples and oranges because really that congregation of drones is really more in an urban environment? I don't know. Those are the things we need to talk about and separate so that we can get some clarity on which situation we're talking about. So I'm going to be coming in probably with the monkey wrenches and be devil's advocate and make us get clarity on these scenarios. Over.
Beautiful. Wes, I'm bringing you up to the stage. You were also interacting on some of these LinkedIn conversations, and I thought you had some really great perspective, I think more from like a military standpoint. And some of your comments remind me of what Michelle just said in terms of like, do we create a mixed use space, or do we designate this certain area or this altitude or whatever it might look like for drones, and then manned aircraft need to avoid that, or who knows? But I thought, yeah, what do you think in 60 seconds or so, 2 minutes, just drones or manned aircraft, who gets the right of way in the low altitude?
Yeah, thanks, David. Brandon, nice to see everybody. Michelle, I definitely agree with you that should be handled on a case by case basis. You know, back 15 years ago, deconflicting airspace as a joint terminal attack controller overseas, you're dealing with, entering and exiting aircraft into a specific block of airspace and trying to mix those aircraft together. I think we have to look at how do we prioritize the level of operations so that we can hand off right of way based upon that operation and the echelon in which they sit. Like Michelle, what you were saying is obviously from the top down, you've got like a distinguished visitor or a VIP or military flying in the airspace into a Class G airspace where drones are operating. We should rapidly be able to give right of way to those aircraft while notifying those UAS operators. Those situations aren't going to be occurring all the time. So establishing that protocol and that communication flow is super critical for those one-offs when they occur. In a more complex airspace where we have, commercial drone delivery operations, emergency responders, commercial or hobbyists operating in the same airspace, I think we really have to look at the ADSB rule. Working through drone delivery in the Part 135 operations, I just found it mad that we didn't, make the right of way be on the UAS by ensuring that every UAS operator has ADSB in, and then also looking at the ADSB rule. I know that general aviation does not want to do ADSB compliance in Class G, and I know that fight is ongoing, but if it's not ADSB, it's got to be some sort of other communication method so that you can notify the operators, and then that is solved, right? So we just have to think outside the box. The technology exists today where you're not, spending too much money to equip your aircraft with something, some type of beacon to give maybe local operators that situational awareness that you're in the area. But I think it's crazy. I have direct experience flying a UAS operations where we did a NOTAM and we're flying over an airfield where you're supposed to communicate, and we have general aviation buzzing the airfield while we're flying a UAS operation with FAA there, like, a couple 100 feet above. And so that has to change completely. And as we move into, defending airspace or critical infrastructure with counter UAS, which is what I'm focused on now, is that delegation of authority to protect that airspace, to protect that infrastructure, needs to also be able to rapidly hand off authority to the entity that's protecting it. And so how do we quickly identify, locking down airspace for commercial operators to get out of the way because we have some sort of threat that just presented itself? And how do we delegate that authority to the counter UAS operators to say, hey, okay, this one is non-compliant. What do we do with it? Because I think that is another thing that we need to start thinking about, is how do we protect that infrastructure and also the people inside that infrastructure with counter UAS threats.
Man,
Go
ahead.
Wes said something that's really important, I think, to think about is to look at 91.225 and the ADSB rule, and remember that rule came out in 2007. So we're coming up on almost 20 years now. And when they were writing that rule, that took quite a long time to write that rule, because at that time that was still new technology and how to integrate that and do all that other stuff. But 20 years later, it's almost antiquated. So I'm sorry, AOPA, when I say this, but engine-driven power, you got to come into the 20th century here, man. And we need power, and it would not take that much to put a battery pack with an ADSB transponder on these aircraft from the 1920s or whatever that you're flying that don't have a power system. ADSB should be required writ large for all GA, period, dot. And it's a safety function. The airspace is becoming too dense where you are a hazard if you don't have it anymore, right? And so I think it's incredibly important, but there will always be a carve out for special government missions, for a lot of operational security, national security means. So there's always going to be an exception. Thankfully, that exception's pretty low. And the only part that I think could maybe make this work is throwing up like a TFR in an area of an operation where ADSB is off. But the only stipulation on that is you can't do that too early, because then it highlights the fact that an operation is about to occur somewhere. So it's kind of got to be like an immediate thing. No?
No, I don't think. I think that adds a level of complexity.
Okay.
One thing that was very interesting when I was at Sage Check, we were doing a conspicuity device. I know UAvionics was working on something too for power hang gliding and power parasailing out in Brazil, because they had so many close mid-airs. And if they're like industry, they were pushing really hard to do that as a standard, because they were protecting themselves, and they were just using a simple power block, right, and an omnidirectional antenna and a very low power conspicuity device, and it was very inexpensive to do something like that. So I agree with Brennan.
And that didn't exist 20 years ago. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle, take it.
Let's go back to that. So this ADSB rule came out way long time ago. There was no UTM then.
Mm-hmm.
What if we have a world now where we could write that rule over again? Would that rule not be mostly the same? In Class G airspace, you don't have to have ADSB. However, you will need to be plugged into a UTM environment.
Well, that's the thing that nobody's saying, right, is that UTM would fix all of this, and we wouldn't have to figure out whose airspace it is, because we'd actually know where everybody else was. And I think that we're getting to this realization that without either all of us having ADSB or all of the manned aircraft pilots having ADSB or both of us having ADSB, that we can't be conflict with each other. And as much as I appreciate it on a case by case basis, that just leads to more confusion, I think.
How would and this is where I get confused about UTM, is that how would that solve this? Because you still have aircraft not pushing ADSB out. And so it's a cooperative versus uncooperative issue, right? And that's always been the problem with integration, is that you have VFR separation. Nowhere really in the world does it have that same type of thing, because we have very accessible airspace compared to the rest of the world. And so if you go ADSB off for an operational mission, how UTM wouldn't solve that problem?
No, it would help though, because we'd actually know where everybody was in the airspace. So even we'd know where all the drones. Well, no, we would know where all the drones are in airspace.
Yeah, Matt, are you saying also have the general aviation comply with some sort of UTM protocol or no?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is, like,
if you can define it, Matt, can you just level set for everybody listening? What is UTM, and how does that help solve this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, UTM, it's unmanned traffic management, and it's a broad term, that requires a bunch of private companies as drone service, the DSS providers, so that at least every compliant or planned drone flight has to, record what they're planning on doing or request permission. It's sort of like we do now with Lance, but everybody would be doing it. Of course, that doesn't account for public safety, because public safety isn't going to tell you what they're about to do. But I mean, UTM has been in the works for 20 years now. NASA's 10 years late on it, 15 years probably by now. So I mean, we don't have a good way of tracking all of the drones at low altitudes, because we didn't require ADSB everywhere. We don't have a great way of tracking all the airplanes at medium and higher altitudes. And so, how are we supposed to deconflict them if we're not required to see where everybody is? Which I guess this is great for Echodyne, David, right? Because radar, right? We could see everybody on radar.
I mean, that's part of it. Obviously, that it's case by case. You couldn't scale radars to you put them on every square inch of the low altitude airspace all over the United States. That'd be great. But at the end of the day, yeah. Yep.
No,
and help a little bit on Brandon's comment there of how does this help, right? UTM is strategic, right? It's not tactical, at least the baseline service. And so the idea is, if you have a mission, and the other thing that UTM does is it's federated, and it's designed in such a way that you don't actually have to tell everybody what you're doing. You only have any kind of interaction if there's an intersection. So if everybody puts their flight plans in, there's no back door into the UTM system that you see all the flight plans, right? Every individual operator has their own, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to tell a centralized system that I have operations in this area. If somebody else comes in and says, I also want to fly in your 4D airspace, the same place and the same time, then the centralized system, it doesn't tell you what someone else's flight plan is. It says, oh, someone else wants to be there too. Go talk to them. And so you do have a layer of security and abstraction where you don't have to give away everything you're doing. You don't even have to say who you are and what you're doing, but you will know if you have a conflicting flight plan with something else that's in the area.
Okay, I want to do a timeout here. So what you're talking about right now, and Carter, is today's vision, today's understanding of UAS traffic management, which, comparatively speaking to legacy aviation, is about in the 1990s. A whole lot has happened in legacy aviation that has grown the situational awareness of our aviation system because of targeted collaboration and information sharing. So while you're talking right now about service suppliers having a specific region and not knowing what the others are doing, and if someone comes in, go talk to them. We have conquered that in legacy aviation, and it works amazingly well, which means there can be situational awareness across service suppliers at some point in the future. Wes, we have counter UAS capabilities that don't need anybody to broadcast. You and I both know that.
Right.
So there is technology that allows us in a 400 foot and below environment to be able to see everything that's going on. If we do a cooperative environment, then GA, flying VFR, instead of filing a VFR flight plan option, you have a file into UTM intent option. And it allows those people that are operating that community at 400 feet and below to get a heads up that somebody else is coming in. We have to prioritize all these mission types. We haven't done that yet to that level of granularity. But guys, we all have the technology to be able to do all of this. We don't have the regulation, and I'm not sure there's the bandwidth on the FAA side at this moment to be able to dig into it. So what do we do right now?
So one thing I want to throw out there, then I'll let you go quick, Brandon, is if you follow the current path down the rabbit hole of where it gets you to on, if we essentially put it on the drone industry to try to figure out what to do about these dark flights. What's happening in the drone industry, and obviously Echodyne being a big part of this, is that we're putting up our own surveillance systems, whether that's counter UAS or just non-cooperative. And so now you have these surveillance footprints that actually see all those dark flights. Those are all commercial footprints. They see more than the FAA knows. They see more than the DoD sees. And they can sell that data to anybody, right? Their job is to make money. They bought a bunch of expensive systems and surveillance, and now they're trying to sell it to the highest bidder, so to speak. And so now you went down this path of saying, this is a security issue. I need to be dark. And now in many places in the US, I can see every one of those, dark or silent craft because I had to spend X millions of dollars to get the drone industry going in that region.
So Andrew, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the ADSB provides that the security missions don't want you to know. They don't want you to know call sign. They don't want you to know certain things that are embedded in an ADSB track where a simple radar return can't give you. And that's actually one of the things we were trying to get some of the federal entities to say is like, look, we can strip all that data out and push that on the back end and push forward. Just I'm a plane and I am here. You don't need to know who I am, what I'm doing, or anything. And they largely fought against that, which didn't make any sense to me because you're going to have a commercial, like you just said, a commercialized private secondary surveillance system inside the United States, and it's going to be there anyways at some point. I mean, North Dakota's doing it with Vantis. Oklahoma's starting to do it. Texas and Dallas are starting to do it. All of these other entities are, and I actually sort of like that model is where the states start providing surveillance in urban areas as a service backed by that, and then it's a pay-to-play system. Just like any airline, they Part 121 air carriers, they have fees, they have landing fees, they have certain things that they have to use the infrastructure to maintain the infrastructure. When we're talking about Part 108, and I'm not talking about someone who does photography or roof inspect, I'm talking about large scale, beyond visual line of sight, major operations, right? Amazon Wing, all these other big ones. You can pay a fee to use that surveillance system because you didn't have to buy that surveillance system, right? And so if everyone's paying into that, there's an initial investment cost, but then it has long-term benefits. And then this whole right-of-way discussion sort of goes away, because that law enforcement operator, if you want to fly BVLOS in an urban environment, you have to tap into the surveillance feed so you can avoid that helicopter flying around with a person that's doing a really important mission. I don't want to see one of Ron's buddies get tagged by a drone. And so that's why I've always been really supportive of, the municipal investment into this, just like they do with airports, and they run airports like a business. They can do the same thing with this.
Being able to turn on that ident at certain cases, depending upon what type of track it is super important, especially when you start talking about counter UAS. A topic that has been constant for like the last 15 years is whose drone is that, right? And in a counter UAS event, that Equidine or that ground-based radar just gives you a blip on the screen and maybe a lat long position altitude, but it doesn't tell you who it is. And when you switch over to trying to rapidly deconflict airspace to determine friend or foe or hostile intent and stuff like that, not being able to identify who that is, what their intent is, or where the operator is, it really just gives you this, I don't know what to do with this aircraft. And that is a real wrench in the counter UAS kind of planning process. Is we have to make a decision at some point. What do we do with those aircraft that are not compliant? You can't communicate with them. They're violating a TFR and they're flying over restricted. And how does that delegated authority get handed off to somebody to do something with that track? And that is a conversation. It's kind of like an ROE, a rules of engagement, or a philosophy conversation that I have all the time with potential customers. And it's like, well, what are we going to do in this civil military operation where we're mixing airspace and we're mixing delegated authority to do something with that airplane?
Yeah.
And I don't think that, ground-based surveillance, these radars provide enough detail in some cases, and the operator is going to have to make a decision, or the delegated authority is going to have to make a decision on what I do with that track if I can't communicate with them.
And Wes, real quick, and so that's from that security counter UAS perspective, right?
Right.
So and that's my world. That's what we both live in every day. So it's hard to, but when I'm talking about ground-based detect and avoid or creating the surveillance system, it's really so a drone operator knows there's a piece of metal in the sky and I shouldn't hit it. I have to give right of way to whatever that thing is, even though I don't know what it is, right? And so, but from the surveillance and the security side, I fully understand what you're saying. I'm just talking about this from the safety deconflict.
Oh yeah, I was just trying to rope in the counter UAS perspective.
I'll say just briefly, since we're mentioning radars, one thing is, let's say at a prison where we put up radars, in that kind of setting where it is sort of a quote unquote counter UAS mission. They're flying contraband in, daily to certain prisons with open rec yards. And so the radar will pick up all these dark drones because they're turning off their transmitters or remote ID, whatever the case. They're cartel backed, pretty sophisticated groups in certain states, that are really getting hit hard. So we'll get the radar hit of incoming. Sometimes there's like 3 drones at the same time, one for overwatch, one for decoy, literally, and another one to deliver. So it's complicated. So it's good to have all those dots on the screen and just like immediate awareness, situational awareness, but then tasking a camera based on that radar track is really important when we just start talking, as an example of layering, different technologies to be able to get down to the detail you need to be able to determine, is this a threat? So like the camera hits one, all 3 of the drones and one of them has a payload on it. and the analytic on the camera plus the the person getting the alert can look at the camera feed. So now it's this nice combination of blip on the screen, but like precise blip, in 3D space. Now you can cue this other sensor, or you could correlate it with a remote ID hit off of that, and start to narrow down very quickly what's going on. Hopefully, when you start layering things. But I'll just mention that.
So Brandon, I had a thought on something that you were talking about. My understanding is most of the missions that you were talking about are ISR type missions. Most of those helicopters aren't transporting a person from point A to point B in dark mode. Outside of some of there are some military transport, but from an ISR perspective, if drones had right of way under 400 feet, why would you spend $5 million on a helicopter if you could do that same mission with a $100,000 drone?
You'd have to ask Ron. Because they're pilots who like to fly helicopters.
I'm just, it seems like if it was easy enough to fly a drone with a similar payload capability, it's probably going to be quieter. It's going to be dramatically cheaper.
No, I don't disagree. And maybe someday we'll get there, but it's not there yet, right? And one thing on the DoD side, right before I left, the previous administrator reiterated to the DoD they would never require them to have ADS-B because of that national security perspective. It's not about ISR or a mission. It's about obscuring assets, where they are, how many we have, and all that stuff, right? And I'll tell you, when I used to live out in Las Vegas and I drive up to Creech, I had A-10s flying right over my car at 200 feet because that's just what A-10s do. And, and so, I mean, again, there's so many different nuances and levels to this. Yeah, Ron, you came off. You've been quiet. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Lots of good stuff on here. So I think you need to look over your shoulder because the AOPA hitman's going to be looking for you there. You're talking user feed. So to Wes's point about NOTAMs, I'll tell you this. My partner, Ray Adams, retired Newark air traffic controller, and we run the Cape Atlantic FAA test range in New Jersey. And back in April, we had a 2-week block where we had operators coming into flying drones up to 3,000 feet. Don't you know, we had DoD assets flying right through the NOTAM area, and some other 3-letter organizations, including some state assets. So don't rely on pilots checking NOTAMs. Yeah, the rules say they're supposed to, but don't rely on that. Something else too, if you look at some of the urban areas with helicopter routes, there's some models in place already that can be taken from that. So helicopters work in and around Class B airspace and complicated airspace all the time. They're expected routes of travel. And I think we're forgetting about EMS helicopters as well. It's not just public safety, law enforcement missions. You're going to have EMS providers going into, off airport, picking up patients and bringing them to hospitals in densely populated areas as well. So look to some of that for guidance as for you, how you regulate the airspace. And I think we still need to sell some of the manned aviation pilots that drones are their aircraft. They have a right to the airspace as well. If we stick with the 107 rule where drones give way, I think we should keep that rule in place until everybody's up to speed. We don't need to change it right now. That's something that we can always revisit. But if we start messing around with that mindset now, I think it's just going to create problems later on.
And so I have one more thing I want to throw out there. And Ron, you said something that kind of triggered it. But we talked about a rule that was pushed out almost 20 years ago, the ADS-B rule. So how do we future-proof Part 108? I don't think the answer is saying, hey, you have to give right away to a drone, because there's going to be so many damn drones in the airspace in 5-10 years anyways. That's not going to be feasible and possible. And so creating, again, these low altitude surveillance systems that are backed by a municipality, and you pay to play, you pay to fly and participate in that system in the urban environment, it future-proofs it a bit, because it adds a capability to that urban environment and area that people can tap into and share. And so not only does the law enforcement, not get collided with, but they can also pull that data feed out if it's in a cloud or whatever that is, and have full awareness on what is going on, which is, I guess, kind of a different way to look at UTM.
Michelle, I'm going to pass it to you. I just want to say, is this kind of like setting up highway systems with like express lanes and other things where eventually, I'm just trying to paint a picture in my head, but like, are we talking about creating like corridors and things that are segmented,
No.
or is it just Okay.
I don't think so. I think what I'm hearing is we keep falling back on the significance of priority missions and how they must have priority. And I fully 100% agree. It's probably less about the platform and it's more about the mission type and then doing the platform prioritization within the mission. Because if it's a public safety, EMS, whatever drone, we want to make sure it can do what it needs to do. If it's a commercial operation, well, we have commercial operations in the NAS. We've had it for, a really long time. I don't know how long. They have a certain priority level. And we have GA aircraft. We have recreational drones. They have a certain priority level. Perhaps we've been looking at this the wrong way. Perhaps we've been so focused on the technology. What if we backed out a little bit and we started focusing on the missions? If you're a commercial drone operator, you have this kind of priority. And if you are up against another commercial manned aircraft, well, now we have a platform and it's performance and risk based. There's a soul on board there.
So can you just put that in, an analogy? Give us an example or two to break it down for listeners. Like what does that look like?
Well, what I'm hearing is we're concerned that drones are going to get in the way of important missions. And whether it's an important mission on a security or a defense side, because that's just what they do, because it is, and we need them to. Or is it a drone going to get in the way of a commercial operation or a GA aircraft? If we are talking to the non-cooperative community writ large, and we built a UTM system that is, I got to stop saying UTM. If we've built a system for low altitude operations, then whomever goes in and out of that low altitude operating environment needs to cooperate somehow. They don't have to put ADSB on, but somehow they've got to let others know they're operating in this area. Whether you're a drone or a glider, I don't care. Does it make sense that if instead we shift the discussion around the missions and stop with the platforms until we get to a spot where we can prioritize within a mission?
I think in some ways, but because I hear what you're saying on it doesn't matter if it's a manned helicopter or a drone conducting the security mission, they have priority because that is the mission. The only thing that is tripping me up is where Ron and I kind of stated very early on is I just have a fundamental issue with, and maybe it's because I'm getting old and I need a shotgun and I'm sitting on my porch and rocking in my chair saying I'll never fly on a thing or whatever, maybe it's that I'm at that point in my life, but I really struggle with the fact that doesn't matter what it is, a thing that has a human being in it has to move out of the way for a safety reason to enable an unoccupied thing that's just material to enable further commercial operations.
Okay, so scenario.
Yeah.
GA pilot out flying. Pleasure flight. Drone carrying blood. Drone carrying an organ.
Sure.
Specifically going towards some hospital that needs it for a transplant now.
Well, you would just have to outsmart me, wouldn't you? Way to come up with the one thing I can't argue against there, Michelle.
But it's mission.
No, so I get it. Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. It does.
So now but had that GA aircraft said, hey, I'm going to be in this environment, this low altitude environment where 400 feet and below drones are operating, they could get a service supplier that builds in a capability, which we don't have right now, but we could in the future, that says, understood, be advised, this is happening, stay out of this little slip.
And I know Ron wants to say something, but does everybody now see why we haven't solved this in 20 years? This is so freaking complicated. Anyways, go ahead.
So with life-saving missions, there's a call sign, right? Lifeguard, or they changed that medevac now. That could be one of those ways where, and same thing with squawks, right? There's emergency squawks, hijack squawks, no radio squawks, right? There's things that can be pushed out to other aircraft that could be picked up by manned aircraft. If there is the case where you have that GA aircraft and you have a drone on a life-saving mission, organs, blood, whatever it might be, that could be where the rules are tweaked to say, in this case, ADSB out would be beneficial to the general aviation public and give way to the medevac aircraft. Even with the rules, they're given priority, but they still have to comply with every other GA rule that is in place, right? They're alerting other traffic that, hey, this mission set needs priority, please give way, right?
I think everything you've said, Michelle, was built on top of a layer of cooperation, right? Once you have cooperative layer, everything else, all the mission priorities, there's a lot of work to be done there, and you're spot on with everything you're saying. I'm concerned that if you don't have cooperation, right? If you have these non-cooperatives, that's where the challenge is today. Because in the example that you guys just gave, you're assuming that the GA coming in has ADSB in. There's no mandate, as far as I know, that they're required to have ADSB in. So if
I was not assuming that.
Well, I was. So Ron was talking about the if the medical drone was squawking that emergency thing, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to consider. But then that guy coming in would now have to have ADSB in, and he didn't want to have ADSB out. Maybe he doesn't have ADSB in, right? So I'm thinking about this layer of, how do we figure out the cooperation? And then it's the cooperation with the people that explicitly have a reason not to cooperate. And that, I think that feels to me like the baseline challenge in all of this. And if we're all in some level of cooperation, that's not the end of the work, right? There's a whole, a whole series of things on mission and priority on top of that.
We have a system based on cooperative operations. Our entire NASA is based on that. All of our rules are based on that. We can have a VFR aircraft that doesn't talk to anybody in the airspace today. That's a non-cooperative. And in our drone community, we find that to be a very scary threat. And we're trying to find ways to regulate out those non-cooperatives. We've not done that for aviation.
So I would flip that a little bit and say, in the drone industry, we've tried to apply millions and millions and millions of dollars of technology to deal with that because it hasn't been regulated out due to pushback by traditional aviation.
Yeah, I mean, there are low-cost ADSB in and out solutions that you could put on general aviation aircraft that aren't, let's say, TSO certified, and get ADSB in on those general aviation aircraft pretty easily, and not absorb exorbitant cost. If we would have done that 10 years ago, we would have spent a lot less money.
It's a choice that our aviation infrastructure, our aviation ecosystem affords this VFR flight thing that nobody else does, and it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to get in your GA aircraft, go fly VFR for the pure joy of it, and not talk to a soul.
Here's one, and this is where I have to throw on the legal piece and what Washington, D.C. has done to me, which I hate, is that I pay attention to words. And I got into this conversation last night with the folks from AUVSI, and it's actually not a privilege. It's a right. And the difference between driving your car is a privilege, which can be taken away by the state at any time for any reason. They don't need to give you a reason. But the federal government can't do that for airspace access because it's actually written in as a public right. And the difference between privilege and right is what's really hanging up a lot of this. And also,
wait, Brandon, you used a license against an environmental an access to an environment. that VFR pilot still has a license. That license can still be pulled.
Right, but they have to have the reason that you violated a regulation, right? And that's one. And again, this is getting very much on the edge of my legal understanding of it. I just know I've had this conversation many times with like Bonnie and Genevieve and all these, and the right is very different than privilege, and there's nuances into that. And I just want to hit on one other thing. And Ron's shaking his head yes, so I'd love to hear his perspective. Aviation is such a tricky thing because it's built on like 110 years of tradition, right? And pilots, they're a passionate group of people. And I mean, it's almost, and I don't want to start a political thing, but it's almost like Second Amendment when you talk to pilots about their aviation and their access to my planes. Very, very hardcore. And so we're it's not only just a technology thing, but it's a cultural thing, and a reluctance to want to change, because a lot of these pilots, especially those old crusty guys sitting at the bar, and they live on an airfield because that's what they do. They want to get in their plane. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want anybody to know where I'm going. I want to fly my plane, and I want to self-separate because I have that visual separation. That's the whole concept behind VFR. That's what it was. It was built on 100 years up to this point when ADS-B rule came out, and that shook up a lot of different things. And so that's a fundamental cultural shift that we're starting to experience. And this is very philosophical now, but I think that's going to have to continue, and we're going to have to be more cooperative, and that VFR state is going to have to change. And I'm sorry, AOPA, please don't find my address and yell at me, but it's going to have to change because we are in a different world than we were. And the airspace is going to become so dense, it's going to be 100% unsafe if we are not cooperative flying within it. And Ron, please, you're that crusty old guy now, so I want to hear your viewpoint.
How do you know I turned 60 last month?
Oh, happy birthday.
No, to your point, though, 49 USC 40103, sovereignty and use of airspace. I talk about this. I do a lot of 107 teaching, right? I treat my clients like they're going to become pilots, right? But if you're a nitwit operating unsafely, you're going to lose that privilege, right? The FAA is going to have something to say about it. And I've actually heard pilots get thrown out of airspace when they just weren't compliant with instructions. So, yeah, there is that balance. But to your point with the freedom aspect of it too, the people in the out west, they just want to get in their aircraft and fly, or the ranchers, herding cattle with their helicopters, whatever the case may be. They don't want to have to be burdened with unnecessary regulations. And barring a crash, the FAA is probably not going to talk to them.
No.
Yeah.
You ever met a bush pilot in Alaska?
So this is why, guys, I think that mission it's feasible for us to consider having this conversation through a mission specific lens. And VFR flying, in my opinion, dude, that is freedom. And it is a mission, and it falls within a hierarchy somewhere because it's real, it's tangible, and it's something special that we offer. I wouldn't want to get rid of it. Change can mean so many things, and it's such a volatile word because we all hate change. But maybe it's evolving. VFR can evolve. VFR rules can evolve to adding something that helps them with their essay. It doesn't have to take anything away.
I think one key thing, right? Some of this conversation sounds like we're talking about the whole airspace, right? We're talking about 400 feet below. Those VFR, and we're talking, largely there's on airfields, right? We're going to have carve-outs that say don't fly your drones over an airfield. Those VFR operations can get in their plane, go fly around, do whatever they want above 400 feet, right? We have taken a small, very small slice of the airspace, which not a ton of people fly anyway for lots of different reasons, and said, hey, we're going to open up an entire new low altitude economy in this slice of airspace, right? We've taken away, maybe we've taken away your freedom, right? Is how they're going to see it, right? To fly in under 400 feet and go, buzz your friend's house and wave to them upside down your plane. that, maybe that goes away, or if you do it, you're taking your own, risk into your own hands. There's not a drone delivering a package to your buddy. But it's not like we're saying general aviation can't go fly their plane anymore. They can't go do, the things that they're already doing most of the time anyway. It's really, do we have to spend $2 billion, whatever, I don't know what the price tag is, but do we have to put all of this instrumentation up for the handful of people that are doing something like that to be able to do it with drones, or do we get a little slice?
And just playing a little bit of devil's advocate, most of what you said I 100% agree with, but you're talking about a $2 billion investment. How much money has been dumped into aviation? Well beyond that. And so, I mean,
I would act, so I'll push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
The money that's been pushed back on that has been into commercial aviation in general by the government, not into general aviation. And I'm saying that not knowing if it's true or not. That's how I think of it. Because most of the people that I see, again, that are living on airfields, those airfields have no instrumentation. There's no tower. There's no ATC services. And so the government has put almost $0 into the drone industry. If the government wants to come in and they want to stand up a US UTM system and put in low altitude aviation, man, I can't tell you how much my company would benefit from that. Right? I'm all for it, but I just don't see it happening.
I have to be a little bit of a smartass, but I don't know how much the government spent on AUS over the last 2 decades, paying people specifically to look at the drone integration issue. So they're spending a lot of money. You're not seeing necessarily in infrastructure and stuff like that, but I think there can be a carve out for infrastructure investment, which would significantly help, and not only help today, but future proof for the next 20 years. By having more awareness of what's in the sky. And that was a fundamental purpose of aviation deconfliction and separation, is awareness of what's in the sky. The federal government doesn't have the resources to invest in a low-level surveillance system. They just don't. And so if states were to push some of that, like some of them already are, Oklahoma, North Carolina, North Dakota, and provide that as a service and model what the FAA has been doing over the last 60, 70 years, that is a path forward. It may not be the one everybody likes, but I think it future-proofs a lot of these things, because not only are you going to have drones, now you have AAM, and they want to occupy that 400-foot airspace too.
Can it be like state by state or like location based too? I mean, you guys were talking about Alaska, like, well, maybe Alaska's different, or the Midwest or wherever they're doing, but like could another state, Denver or whatever, or,
Sure.
And that's why I'm like a huge thing of like, let the states do it. Let's create some legislation around delegation of authority in some way, shape, or form from the FAA to the state level, who has a lot more awareness and sensitivity to their own local issues, their topography, all that other stuff.
Counter UAS maybe in that?
Counter too. Well, and that's why if you create a low-level surveillance system, it complements both the security side for critical infrastructure and a lot of these other locations, and separation. And so
take it a step forward. Take it a step forward. We are not only going to be helping drones in this low altitude operating environment, we're also going to be evolving the VFR general aviation situational awareness environment that we haven't had a handle on yet. We still don't know how to get quantifiable data on how many VFR aircrafts operate in this particular area. We still don't know how to do that. But this system that we're talking about, and the opportunity that we have in front of us now with modernizing the air traffic system, I mean, guys, we have the opportunity now to be creating that bridge between this low altitude operating environment discussion that we're having and those legislative minds who are thinking about what that ATC modernization has to include. So I love this, Brandon, that we encourage there to be an encouragement of state-led innovation to establish that low altitude infrastructure. Bring in whoever you want. Just establish that low altitude infrastructure We've got to evolve the VFR rules so that we can give situational awareness to those folks too who are flying purely for the joy of flying, and they don't need to talk and squawk. They just need to have an awareness. And if we create this environment that gives them that awareness, and the drones can still operate and do their missions at the same time, we have a prioritization of mission. We're getting there.
Yeah. And I just want to end with this last 15-second thing. So I think the way to evolve VFR is get away from the word see and avoid to detect and avoid. And then you can see in different ways. And that could be air-based detect and avoid, ground-based detect and avoid through the low-level surveillance on the state things. But I think that's the way VFR needs to evolve, is to rethink, I don't need to see with my eyes. I need to see with sensors.
Well, yeah, there is a consortium trying to do eVFR, right? Electronic Visual Flight Rules, which is bringing in what you're saying is some sort of means. Yep.
And to be clear, Brandon, I 100% agree with you, and that's where we're at today. We're actively building those systems, and a lot of the states that you mentioned, it's expensive and it's difficult. And so, my devil's advocate was, if we're going to have the conversation about, what could it look like if we had our way from a regulatory perspective, other options, and barring regulation change, which this whole thing started in what's coming with Part 108. It is it's exactly what you're talking about, and a lot of the states are doing that and moving forward with it, and being successful with it.
Yeah, aviation's not easy, right? And I don't think we should be trying to look for the easy solution. We need to be looking for the right one, even if it's more expensive.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. That was a great discussion. And thanks everyone for listening in, sending in your comments. It was so lively back and forth that I wasn't able to bring up very many of your comments on screen. But thanks for the activity and everybody being engaged. And go to thisweekindrones.com/connect if you want to be on a podcast or you've got insights and thoughts. We'd love to hear from you as well. But thanks all the panelists, everybody for jumping on. Andrew and Wes and Ron for being special guests again. But we'll talk to you all soon. We'll see you again next week.
See you guys.
See you.